The soaring flight of birds has appealed to people through the ages as the ultimate example of freedom. To break the bonds of gravity, to go effortlessly wherever sight can travel. The experience of flight is available to individuals too, to soar on the wind, not escaping gravity, just delaying it a bit. I have the freedom to jump off these cliffs. There's nothing here to stop me. But without a glider and the skills to fly it, my flight would be short and disastrous. Obviously, freedom is a lot more than just being set loose.
There is a story about a very sad bear who lived in an exceedingly small cage in the town zoo. When the bear wasn't eating or sleeping, he spent all of his time pacing, 6 steps forward and 6 steps back again. Again and again, the bear paced out the limits of his very small cage. Then one day, the zookeeper said, "It's very sad to see this bear pacing in his confining cage. I will build him a bigger cage so he won't have to pace back and forth, again and again." And so he did. And then the day came to let the bear into his new cage. The whole town was excited and came to see what would happen. They let the bear in. First he looked to his right, and then to his left, and he started to move. He took 6 steps forward and 6 steps back again. Again and again. To the shocked amazement of the crowd, the sad bear paced out the limits of his old familiar cage.
The sad bear story reminds us that freedom is more than the absence of restrictions. It also requires the ability to act, the power to do something with available opportunities. There are 2 kinds of freedoms, freedom to and freedom from. When people think of freedom, they usually think of freedom from the absence of restrictions, no cages or unreasonable controls laid on by other people. Freedom to is much harder to define. It involves all of the skills, powers, and tools available to a person to actually do something. Without the ability to take action, freedom from restrictions means very little. For instance, it wouldn't matter if there are no rules against talking in the corridors at school if one were too shy and awkward to talk anyway. In the same way, there was nothing restricting me from jumping off those cliffs, except that I knew that I didn't have the skills and the tools to do so without inviting disaster. So in a practical sense, I wasn't really free to jump. Preparing people to handle freedom, to understand and develop their powers, is one of the most important tasks of a society. But it's a task that's not well understood. We still have much to learn about the best way to do it. However, we do know that freedom and learning are closely associated.
All life forms have a variety of powers or abilities and potentials that are, in a manner of speaking, built into their design. Power is the ability to do things, to change oneself or the environment. Among other things, this gerbil is designed for living in burrows in desert conditions. It can manufacture within its body much of the water it needs, using the food it eats. It's also designed for digging and will spend much of its time making digging motions, even if there's nothing to dig into.
Farley here has a much different design and much different equipment. He's perfectly suited for hunting, for operating socially in packs, and for trotting 40 kilometers or more a day.
Neither Farley nor the gerbil have been raised in the conditions for which they were designed. They are pets whose needs are taken care of for them. Even though Farley is in many ways a more powerful animal, he would probably have less chance of survival on his own than the gerbil if both were released in their home environments. Because wolves are more intelligent animals, they must learn much of what they need to know to survive in the wild from other wolves. They must learn how to hunt cooperatively in packs, to bring down larger game, and how to root out smaller game like mice and voles. The simpler the animal, the less effect confinement is likely to have on them, because a larger part of their powers are instincts or automatic responses that require very little learning. Learning is a way of customizing powers, matching ability to the needs of a particular environment. The more sophisticated the creature, the more they are shaped by experience. Human beings are the most complex creatures on the planet. Our living and learning arrangements have a profound effect on our powers and what we turn out to be. Although we are shaped by the situations we live in, we can always make things better or worse by the choices we make. There's a peculiarity in the way people can select what to do with themselves that will give us an indication of whether or not their powers match the circumstances that they're in. Choice is basically about the quality of experience. Some experiences are a whole lot better or worse than others. And when we choose our actions, we are managing experience. Everyone has the power to change their experience by taking action. But the really interesting thing is that we can achieve similar results by taking action on very different kinds of things. To see this more clearly, we have to take a look at all those things that influence experience. Experience is a product of both internal and external events. This means that in any situation, there are always options for improving experience. What we choose to do reflects our freedom to act skills, our ability to make things happen in the different option areas. Let's start with a situation where somebody's having a bad time, like attending a party where they might feel out of place. The people there are dressed differently, talk about unfamiliar things, and maybe playing the wrong sort of music. If our system works, we have at least 4 very different kinds of actions that could be taken to change that experience. First, we could take physical action to change the outside world.
I'd leave.
Well, I'd walk out. I guess you'd want to leave.
Party like that, wouldn't be able to change anything. I'd leave.
These people suggest that the way to change the outside world is to move away from the situation. Another way would be to change the situation you find yourself in.
Well, if you were up to it, I suppose you could change the music. Yeah, but you wouldn't dare do that.
Depends how many people there were there.
Well, if they were that different, you could show them what you do, like dancing, maybe?
The outside world contains social things as well as physical things. There are lots of possibilities in this category. Let's move on to the next.
You could always ignore them.
What, like hide yourself in a corner, Bruce?
Well, if you're not leaving, you'd want to do something.
Not very subtle, but changing the way you sense things is an effective way of changing your experience. But it could get boring inside that head, so let's take a look at something a little more imaginative.
You could always eavesdrop on somebody else's conversation.
Well, if there's some interesting guy there, I might stay.
Always check out the girls.
In any situation you don't enjoy, there might be 1 or 2 good things that you could focus your attention on.
If there's nothing else to do, you could always join in.
Or at least get to know him.
The if you can't like them, join them routine takes a whole lot of new interpretation or thinking powers, looking for what is good in the situation instead of focusing on the bad or unfamiliar. This usually results in at least an interesting time, if not a fun one, which is still a whole lot better than having a bad time. Now let's take a look at one last category of option.
If you were staying, you could look for the booze.
Yeah, you could always get out of it if you have some booze.
The guys always start drinking.
Girls do it too.
Everybody takes booze to a party.
Internal conditions can also be changed by intoxicants. Intoxicants are any substance that changes the way the brain works. Things like alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, tranquilizers, dope, and so on. There are other ways of changing internal conditions besides using intoxicants. Fasting, exercise, meditation, all those will do it. But intoxicants are usually easier and faster to use, so they're more popular. Overuse of intoxicants usually indicates a lack of freedom to skills in the other option areas. Even when a person's other powers aren't up to a situation, being intoxicated is something anyone can do. Intoxicant use is so easy that it will always be within reach of a person's capabilities. At a basic level, all you have to know how to do is to swallow. We've all heard stories of people who drink too much or use tranquilizers heavily because their life situation is in some way or another beyond them. During the Vietnam War, thousands of American soldiers took to using heroin as a means of managing their experience. Many people thought then, and still do, that drug use led inevitably to heavier and heavier addiction, that the drug itself created the addiction, and that only through special treatment could the addiction be broken. So, although no generally effective treatment programs were known, the government started to prepare massive treatment facilities for what they thought would be the return of thousands of addicts. To their surprise, 85 to 90% of the identified heroin users in Vietnam showed no interest in using the drug again when they returned home. Obviously, something had changed. Anyway, a group of people here in Canada became interested in explaining what was happening. So what was going on with these guys? Well, here at Simon Fraser University, a Dr. Bruce Alexander and his students decided to try to find out. It's very difficult to run addictions experiments with people, but there's a wide body of literature that suggests that lots of rats will use morphine if given a chance. They decided to do their investigations using rats. Most university rats live in small cages like these, and Dr. Alexander reasoned that if he were living in something so restricted, he might want to spend most of his time stoned too. To test his idea, he had to have a different environment, a more interesting place for the rats to live. So, Rat Park. Here the rats have the space to do things for which rats are designed. They can play, they can fight, they can hoard, chew, mate, nest, and raise their babies. To test the effect of the environment on addiction, Dr. Alexander put morphine in both groups of rats' drinking water. After 30 to 40 days, both groups had become thoroughly addicted. They were then given a choice by putting in a pure water bottle along with a morphine water container. The results? The rats in Rat Park take far less morphine than the ones in the cages. The environmental effect was there. In restricted surroundings where they could not develop their powers, the rats stayed stoned. In the expansive environment, the rats showed little interest. Dr. Alexander opened up some very useful approaches to addiction research. Obviously, a lot more work needs to be done, but we are beginning to understand more about overuse of intoxicants, what it means, and how to prevent such problems in the future. This nursing home is clean, the rooms are reasonably comfortable, and the staff are as friendly and as helpful as one might expect. But for many people living in this kind of institutional environment, there is something of a caged effect. Somewhere along the line, in our efforts to help those who cannot help themselves through old age or illness, we've forgotten about the effects of environment on people and people's powers. An efficient environment isn't always the best for human growth. The results? For too many, it is heavy intoxicant use, mostly prescribed tranquilizers and sedatives, or it may be depression, hopelessness, or even suicide. We still have much to learn about aging and ways of encouraging people to keep exercising their powers, and newer designs for nursing homes reflect some of these concerns. Isolated or narrow work environments can also have a confining effect on people. On the surface, there's not much to do here but work, and the work in these camps is often tedious and none too pleasant. Heavy intoxicant use has always been a feature of frontier towns and isolated work camps. People living in these situations have found that they can reduce some of this by creating facilities for a greater range of challenging and interesting activities. Sporting facilities, theaters, libraries, workshops, physical training equipment, and other such things that increase the opportunity to exercise one's powers. When you think of ghetto, you usually think of crumbling slums, rat-infested rooms, boarded-up windows. That's one type of ghetto. This is another. Suburbia can be a kind of ghetto to anyone who must spend most of their time here. Suburbia can have many of the characteristics of isolated work camps. The environment is not very engaging. Women and youth are more likely to be stuck here full-time than men, but the tedium and isolation could have the same effects on anyone: boredom, depression, and passive dependence on television, alcohol, or tranquilizers. Recognizing that isolation and underuse of their powers can lead to depression and eventual loss of freedom, many women are now pursuing interests and work beyond the home. The way we equip youth with the powers to manage their lives has changed drastically in the past half-century. Prior to 1941, less than 40% of the kids aged 14 to 19 were enrolled in school. Before that time, high school was not mandatory. Most youth were learning about the world and their powers the way young people had learned from the dawn of time, by working alongside more experienced adults handling real problems and real opportunities in the community. But the problems and opportunities were changing. The most significant characteristic of our civilization is the knowledge explosion. The knowledge explosion is occurring so rapidly it's difficult to appreciate its full impact. If we start back here at the dawn of time and move forward to the year 1700, by that time humankind had accumulated 1 unit of knowledge. Between 1700 and 1850, we had doubled that to 2. Between 1850 and 1900, it doubled again. Now, in the 1980s, it's doubling every 8 to 10 years. To help visualize the knowledge explosion, let's start here on the ground floor at the dawn of time. By the year 1700, we'd taken just 1 step up to here. By the year 1850, we'd come up 2. By the year 1900, we'd climbed about to here, and then things really started to happen. Up to about 1930, we'd come this far, and they started accelerating even more. By the 50s, we'd come a full 3 stories. But to the 80s, we would have come more than 20 stories. But by the end of the 90s, we'd need a building at least twice this tall. That means that in a 50-year period, 97% of everything the world knows will have been discovered. That's a tremendous amount to know about. But most of it won't be connected to our immediate experience, and much of it won't be personally useful. But being prepared to handle that world out there means something quite different today than it did 50 years ago. We're now living in an information society where being an apprentice carpenter or a dressmaker are no longer adequate preparations for living. Mandatory high school education seemed to be the best way to equip people with the perspectives necessary to handle the world out there. Although it's now clear that 12 years of education are no longer enough. People will have to continue learning throughout their whole lives. The problem is that information and knowledge are only one part of our power to do things. We also need initiative or creative spark, and the skills, tools, and wherewithal to actually do something. Knowledge alone is not enough. In our haste to keep up with the knowledge explosion, we have not developed these other aspects of our powers. No matter how hard we try, books, papers, and pencils cannot substitute for real experience. We design and build playgrounds like these out of kindness and concern for children. Yet if you look at their design and their structure carefully,
you'll see that they're made more with the needs of adults in mind than the needs of children. They're solid, fixed, safe, neat. They permit the children to change very little. In fact, this kind of playground does little to develop the initiative, the judgment, the skill that less structured play areas that were typical of a generation or two ago permitted. In the past, we didn't have specifically designed play areas like these. Kids played wherever they could, usually in vacant fields, open lots, empty spaces that weren't being used for something else. These spaces permitted kids to do things like building tree houses, digging holes, lighting fires, even shooting their BB guns or .22 rifles. All of these activities were activities with risks, but they permitted the children to learn something about their powers, about the way the world worked, to take responsibility. It's not that the good old days were so great, it's just that today we're having to design things that we've never had to think about before.
Television has radically altered the way people spend their time. The average 18-year-old has spent more time in front of a television set than they've spent in school. This is a lot of time that does little to develop one's sense of powers and potentials. Watching other people handle real problems in real situations can teach us much about the world. Intelligent viewing of TV programs could teach us much about what it is to be alive and human. Unfortunately, it is much easier to watch programs that entertain but teach little.
Together.
Wow. Doesn't? Not that many.
The environments we create then create us. Neither the sad bear nor the rats in the rat park experiment had any choice about their environments, and so could not control what they became. As individuals, we often don't have much choice about our environments either. But socially we do. Most of our living arrangements are group creations, the results of many people acting together over time. This is why it's so important for everyone to know what is at stake, and why we cannot separate the powers and the problems of individuals from the wisdom of our social arrangements. Obviously, there is still much to be done. Yet people are not simply products of their environment. There is also the universe within. It has been said that experience is not what happens to a person. Experience is what a person does with what happens. By activating internal resources, it is possible to change the meaning and impact of almost anything. Problems can be seen as opportunities, threats as challenges, and confinement as a personal obstacle course. How we interpret events makes a great difference in our experience and what we decide to do next. History is full of examples of people who were able to turn the worst misfortunes into a source of learning and strength. Freedom requires skills that are developed only through experience, although we can learn much about what there is to learn from watching others.
We can only become what we've been equipped to become, but at some point, everyone is free to choose their own equipment.